Okay, so I'm here to give a virtual version of the Tagore and Kipling lecture that had to be cancelled in week 5. For ease of consumption, I'm going to split it into 3 parts, roughly kind of podcast length, so about 15 minutes each. First one's going to be on British India in general, then a section on Tagore and Kipling, their lives, their biography, and then finally turning to an analysis of the stories. So I am going to have to keep on leaning forward to switch the slides, but as I say, the first part is going to be on Victorian India, British India. I'm going to trace a longer history though, so it's worth beginning with a map of contemporary India. And there's 2 things I guess that I want to get across. First is that large, enormous nation state of India, then as now, was a kind of patchwork, immensely diverse, a real variety of cultural groupings, religious groupings, linguistic groupings. And it's a really phenomenal story about, firstly, how this was forged into an imperial entity under British rule, often with much violence and oppression, but it happened, and then that it became a modern day nation state and indeed the world's biggest democracy. So there's a kind of internal variety to India we need to acknowledge, which was very much part of the colonial experience as well. The second thing is that the history of British India encompasses many of the present day nation states around India. British India in the 19th century was not just present day India. It would encompass states like Pakistan or Bangladesh, and indeed kind of bled into places like Afghanistan, Myanmar or Burma. Sri Lanka would be known as Ceylon at the time. Even the Andaman Islands down there in the Bay of Bengal. It had within its sphere of influence the Persian Gulf, Singapore. So British India the history of British India is not just the history of India, it's the history of Pakistan, it's the history of Bangladesh, and of course the colonial and post-colonial histories of those countries, very, very convoluted in their own way. Bangladesh is an excellent example. There it is on the right-hand side, green. It's a Bengali country. It speaks the language Bengali, as do the Indians across the border. However, the province of Bengal in India is predominantly Hindu. Bangladesh is predominantly a Muslim country. Now, of course, tensions between Islam and Hinduism were certainly there in the epoch we're looking at, and indeed they were of great concern to Rabindranath Tagore, who was himself a Bengali. But the division between the nation states wasn't there. As we can see by looking at this map of India in 1795, where the pink stretch there on the right hand side, that is Bengal. Now, British territory is in pink, and one thing you will notice is that the British foothold in the Indian subcontinent is, although large because it's a large continent, is relatively limited if you look at all the other patchwork of states that make up the subcontinent. As the key at the bottom left suggests, the pink bits don't tell the full story, because what the British also did was establish a client states. What they would do, they would have protected states. They would have local rulers that would be diplomatically, economically, militarily dependent on the British. So they weren't directly part of the British Empire, but they kind of were. And that pattern of having client states as well as directly administered territories, that went right through the history of British India. But as you can see here, in 1795, there was a lot that lay outside of British control. If we move forward 60 or so years to 1856, so just before Kipling and Tagore were born and became young men in the second half of the 19th century, there's an enormous expansion in British control in British India. So the pink areas have massively expanded, as have those greeny blue areas which depict British protected states. And we can see the sway of British control goes right to the bottom, goes right up to Kashmir, which is of course a flashpoint for present day India and present day Pakistan. It's pushing all the way to the west, there we are, to the left-hand side of the map, all the way on the other side up to sort of present-day Burma. In 60 years, it's an enormous territorial expansion, and it brings that immense, diverse, heterogeneous patchwork of groups, of states, of statelets, of peoples, of languages, of religions under British control either direct or indirect. And obviously that's a very complex and fascinating story. Before I tell that story, just another map to give a sense of this diversity I'm talking about. I've used stars to indicate key points which are relevant to the study of Tagore and Kipling, and to just show you how different areas existed within British India. So the red star there is Bombay, or present day Mumbai. That was one of known as the three presidencies. The others were Madras and Calcutta, or present day Kolkata. And Bombay was a really key centre, therefore, of British power. It was also where Rudyard Kipling himself was born. Now, if we move north to the yellow star, Lahore in present-day Pakistan, Kipling, as I'll explain in the second half, or the second segment of the lecture, went back to Britain for schooling and then returned as a journalist. His first posting was in Lahore. Now, at the time, that was the centre of the Sikh Punjab. And unlike somewhere like Bombay, this was only very recently part of British India. It was only annexed in 1849 after a series of conflicts with the Sikh Empire. And Lahore, a very ancient city, is the setting for the House of Sidhu and also Beyond the Pale. Moving hundreds of miles, I'm not very good with east and west today, east, there we go, towards the western Himalayas, that's where the other Kipling story we're studying is set. That's Lisbeth. She is described as of the hill people, and that's where the green star is. So sort of on the fringes of the Punjab, even more frontier territory. Now moving to the exact opposite, in a sense, to another of the presidencies, this is Calcutta, or Kolkata. That's the dark blue star at the centre of Bengal, which is very much one of the first footholds of British colonial power in British India. This is Tagore's city. It wasn't only the centre of British imperial operations, it was also the centre for a very progressive, well-educated Indian culture, which was known as the Bengal Renaissance, and that Tagore's own family were very much part of that Bengal Renaissance in the first half of the 19th century. As I say, Tagore's own city, and it's the setting of Fury Appeased, not coincidentally a story that features a theatre. Moving westwards to the purple star, that's Ranaghat. This is the rural settings in and around Bengal. That's the setting for The Living and the Dead. And Tagore, as I'll explain a little bit in the second segment, was a landlord who had to go out, visit these villages, particularly in and around the river deltas. That's where his family had land holdings, and he would have to go and sort of meet the tenants and stuff. And that's where a lot of the inspiration for his early stories, such as Living and the Dead, come. Moving up to where that light blue star is, that's Darjeeling, wedged in between Nepal and Bhutan. Again, a little like the Punjab, that was a relatively recent addition to British India, annexed in the 1860s after conflicts with the Gurkhas. This was a hill station, that is a place where the colonial elites could retreat to the cool of the hills during the really, really hot summers. The final star that I've put on there, just to give you another kind of geographic locale, that's the orange one, Allahabad. This was Kipling's second posting as a journalist, and as the name suggests, it was a Muslim city in Hindustan, which would have been the contemporary name for northern India. Hindustan is also where the mysterious woman in the story False Hope comes from, the kind of Brahmin daughter who falls in love with a Muslim general. So you can see an immense variety of, like I say, states, systems, peoples, cultures, languages, ethnicities, religions, and all of them come to form, firstly, British India, and ultimately this set of modern nation states in the Indian subcontinent. How does that happen? We start with the East India Company, because one of the curious things is Britain does not rule India directly, at least not at first. It is a corporation set up in the 17th century, and it's as if the American government asked Google to run a state, I suppose. After the 7 Years' War, which was a war against France in both North America and Asia and other places, including the Caribbean, for example, Britain won the 7 Years' War in 1763, and after that, a lot of territory in India came under East India Company control. The way they ruled it was a kind of dualistic model. What they would do is they would preserve a lot of the historic structures. They would work with local elites. Work with might be a slightly dodgy term. Of course, there's a clear power imbalance there, but um, there would be a system that involved local elites, and they would look at what the local conditions were, whatever system of land ownership was there or rent collection, and they would work with that. What the East India Company provided was bureaucracy, was administration, and military support. And the East India Company effectively had, in the wake of the 7 Years' War, their own army, which was manned by sepoys, who are native Indian soldiers commanded by white European officers. So they have lots of different ways. If they're in one bit of India, they work with one system and one local elite. In another bit, they'll do it in a slightly different way. However, because of a series of pressures, including Britain catapulting everyone into the Industrial Revolution and the kind of capitalist economy that goes along with it, the East India Company became more and more centralised and interventionist, and they built a more kind of uniform bureaucracy. That particularly happened from 1828 onwards, the reforms of a guy called Lord Bentinck. And what that happened was some of those old relationships with the local landed elites, the Indian elites, were pushed to the centre as the company pursued a much more commercial, kind of mercantile bourgeois set of relationships. There were bureaucratic reforms, there were legal reforms, there were economic reforms. There's also important cultural reforms, which are quite interesting. One of the things that Bentinck does is try to abolish the practice of sati, which is the ritual burning of Hindu widows on the pyres of their husband. And this is a big kind of anxiety for the British, and it's about civilization and savagery, or it's perceived as such. We have a scene of a British man rescuing a widow from sati, from a pyre, in 80 Days Around the World, for example, much later. The interesting thing is that Bentinck moves to outlaw this, to sort of intervene in local Hindu practice and say no. But he got a lot of support from Hindu progressives, people in fact like Tagore's own father, who saw it as part of the modernising and the civilizing, in a sense, of their own culture. So things are always a little bit textured. There's never just a kind of white versus Indian dynamic here. There's lots of overlapping relations. As the map shows, between 1795 and 1856, with each decade, as well as centralising, as well as creating bigger sets of kind of legal and bureaucratic apparatus, what the East India Company was annexed more territory until they dominated the whole continent. Now, of course, that created friction. And that friction broadly spilt over in 1857 in something that's traditionally been called the Indian Mutiny, but would now be called a rebellion, a revolt, or sometimes the First Indian War of Independence. What happened was those native troops, or some of them, the sepoys, rose up against the East India Company. Now, the East India Company crushed that rebellion, not least with the help of other sepoys and more loyal native elites. But London, looking on, realised or perceived that maybe the East India Company were losing control. So what they did was they dismantled it and established direct rule from London through the government, through the crown. Queen Victoria ultimately becomes Empress of India. Now, this seems like a big psychological change, but historians have since argued that to an extent it merely formalises something that was there all along in the 19th century. Since the 18th century, Parliament had done lots of things to kind of hem in or oversee or regulate or work with the East India Company. It wasn't just this kind of bunch of corporate capitalists going in and running a country. London was supervising a lot, and to all intents and purposes, of course, India was an imperial colony, even when it was run by the East India Company. However, in the wake of 1857, the British government did want to try and do things a little bit differently in order to forestall any other rebellions. So what they established or tried to extend was a colonial apparatus which would educate up an Indian native elite who would be able to have, on behalf of the British, they would be loyal to the British, but they would be able to run, to an extent, the affairs of their own society. That was the aspiration, but it actually proved very, very difficult for native Indians to get senior positions in, for example, the Indian Civil Service, or to become officers in the British Indian Army. One of the reasons for that is the late 19th century, so the 1860s, 70s, 80s. This is very much the height of the British Empire, and particularly of racialised attitudes about white superiority in the British Empire, which are driven by things like racialized interpretations of Darwinism. And so, obviously, white Europeans, both in Britain and kind of Anglo-Indian whites, are going to resist Asian native elites coming in to kind of stir things up. One kind of element which we might kind of, what would be the word, kind of crystallise this around is something called the Ilbert Act, or the Ilbert Bill rather, in 1883. Now what that did, Courtney Ilbert was the legal advisor to the Viceroy of India at the time, and he suggested that European whites should, under the law, have to face Indian judges. Now, that created a great deal of opposition among European whites in British India, but it also mobilised some of those Indian elites who very much wanted those kind of reforms to be brought into place. And it was one of the reasons that the forerunner conference, the Indian National Congress, was set up. So in 1883, the Ilbert Bill becomes this nexus of conflict and debate about the relationships between white and Asian in British India. Like I said, in 1883 and what happens afterwards, this is in some ways a trigger for Indian nationalism to coalesce around this issue. Indian nationalism had certainly existed before, but it built up a real head of steam in the 1880s. And to some extent, that is all to do with that development of an Indian elite. That's at least one historical interpretation of it. What British rule did in India was create immense sets of economic and social changes. And what that did was had a knock-on effect on the existing social and class structures within Indian population. So, for example, we have the emergence of an Indian middle class in present-day Calcutta, or Bombay. And a lot of people would say those were the groups, the cultural groups, who began to think about reform, think about revising the relationship with British rule. Now, there's no uniform attitude. Indian attitudes would vary and continue to vary in lots of different ways. For example, there's a lot of internal tension between Hindu and Muslim. So I put Hindi there, which is a language. I meant Hindu and Muslim, the two kind of religious sides. Although there's a lot of variety, should you be revolutionary? Should you be more cautiously reformist? Should you work with the British? Should you work against the British? The kind of groups and classes that emerge in the late 19th century are probably the ones that spearhead the idea of Indian nationhood, and ultimately that leads to Indian independence in 1947. And there's a kind of historical irony here. The British put huge amount of kind of material investment in creating their jewel in the crown colony, British India, and they transform it. But in transforming it, in putting down, schools, in setting up the railways, in establishing an immensely complex bureaucracy, the Indian civil service, what they help to do is create the very conditions, economic conditions, social conditions, and ultimately intellectual conditions, in which groups of native Indians could come together, create discourse, which enabled a nationalist consciousness to emerge, and ultimately a kind of nationalist politics. So the seeds of the Raj's decline are sown in the Raj's kind of expansion and development from this period, the end of the 19th century. And this is very much Kipling and Tagore's formative years, and their work responds to it. I'll talk about Kipling and Tagore in the second segment of this lecture.